Okay, thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm Jill Fraley. I'm a professor here at the law school. I teach property, constitutional law, and my area of expertise is in legal history. And I am delighted to welcome here today Professor Stephen Cushman. This is a part of our ongoing law and history lecture series here at the law school. And we are very grateful to Pete Hendricks, who is our donor and who makes this series possible every year. Unfortunately, he can't join us today, so we can't thank him in person, but we're very grateful for his ongoing support. And so I have the honor of introducing Professor Cushman, who is actually by training not a historian, but in fact an English professor. But his area of expertise involves how literature influences our perceptions. And he is the author of a number of books of poetry, but also a couple of books on the Civil War. And one of his areas of expertise is on thinking about how literature shapes our understanding of such major public events as the Civil War. So today his official topic is George B. McClellan, Robert E. Lee, and the Laws of War Before the Lieber Code. Thank you, Professor Cushman. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. Sound okay on the mic? Can you hear all right in the back? Yep, okay. I hope everybody has a handout. That's as high-tech as this presentation will get. And I'm going to start by talking about what I'm not going to talk about, which is the actual Lieber Code itself. But I wanted you to see what it looks like, what its table of contents is, so that you have an idea of what is coming right after the period I'm going to be talking about. Francis Lieber was a very interesting man, born in Prussia, fought against Napoleon, came to Boston in 1827. He had 3 sons, 2 of whom fought for the North and 1 of whom fought for the South. And the one who fought for the Confederacy was actually killed facing George McClellan on the peninsula. After this moment that I'm going to be talking about, Lincoln charged Lieber, or through an intermediary, charged Lieber with formulating laws of war. And what you see before you is what he came up with and what was promulgated by Lincoln in April of 1863. So that's what's going to happen right after what I'm talking about. I'm going to start us in March 1862. And I'm going to start us with Nathaniel Hawthorne. When Nathaniel Hawthorne traveled from Massachusetts to Washington, he did so, he said, to look a little more closely at matters there. And he later published his account of his trip as the essay Chiefly About War Matters, printed in the July 1862 Atlantic Monthly. In this essay, he noted meeting George B. McClellan in Washington against the backdrop, and I'm now quoting Hawthorne, of a most fierce and bitter outcry and detraction loud and low against him, accusing him of sloth, imbecility, cowardice, treasonable purposes, and in short, utterly denying his ability as a soldier and questioning his integrity as a man. In contrast, Hawthorne offered his own more favorable endorsement, taking his cue from the cheers of McClellan's soldiers as the general rode past them. And here is Hawthorne again. If he, McClellan, is a coward or a traitor or a humbug or anything else less than a brave, true, and able man, that mass of intelligent soldiers whose lives and honor he had in charge were utterly deceived. And so was this present writer. For they believed in him, and so did I. And had I stood in the ranks, I should have shouted with the lustiest of them. There's a political backstory here, too. Hawthorne was a Democrat, and McClellan was a Democrat as well, so there's some political connection. Since Hawthorne put the dark side of McClellan's reputation on public record in 1862, it has remained alive and well. Deriving their authority from the prestige of psychoanalysis, McClellan's harshest critics have attempted to account for the dark side of his reputation by subjecting McClellan himself to unsparing psychiatric examination. Leading scholars of the Civil War have compiled a formidable train of terms and descriptors for George McClellan's innate psychological defects. And I'm now going to give you this is one of my favorite lists that I've ever compiled. This is now a list of all descriptors taken from Civil War historians describing McClellan. Manic depression, arrogant confidence, wretched self-abasement, vanity, instability, inherent lack of discipline, pathological lying, unrestrained ego, delusions of grandeur, possession by demons, psychosis, morose view of life, dark fatalism, martinet tendencies, innate querulousness, persecution complex, messianic complex, paranoid personality disorder, and finally, in a quaint nod to the pre-psychoanalytic worldview of Aristotle's Poetics, tragic flaw. I come neither to bury George McClellan under more censure, nor to try to praise him up and out from underneath it. Rather, my aim here is to set aside for a moment both censure and praise in order to examine McClellan's understanding of the laws of war 6 or 7 months before Francis Lieber began drafting his code in December of 1862. The primary lens through which we shall do this examining will be the one-volume memoir of McClellan's life called McClellan's Own Story. This book was published posthumously in 1887 in New York by the New York publishing firm associated with Mark Twain, called Charles L. Webster and Company. The editor of McClellan's posthumous memoir was McClellan's friend and advisor during his 1864 campaign for the presidency against Abraham Lincoln, Democratic newspaper editor William C. Prime. And there's a nice stitch here. Almost 20 years earlier, William C. Prime had been mercilessly lampooned by Mark Twain in The Innocents Abroad for what Twain saw as Prime's sentimentalized travel writing. For us in this room, the main question is this. During the much-studied part of his life, when he was waging war against Robert E. Lee on the Virginia Peninsula formed by the James and York Rivers, during the spring and summer of 1862, without the Lieber Code before him, what precedents did the commanding general of the United States Army have to guide and constrain his war-making powers against the Confederacy? He could have had a book by the Swiss philosopher, diplomat, and legal theorist Emmerich de Vattel, a book entitled The Law of Nations, which was published in French in 1758 and translated into English in 1760. Vattel's work is divided into 4 books, the third of which is entitled Of War. Vattel was cited in an 1862 U.S. Supreme Court case considering the constitutionality of Lincoln's blockade against southern ports, and his book is listed still in the United States Department of Defense Law of War Manual as a subsidiary authority for determining the rules of law in war. We know that Benjamin Franklin and George Washington both owned copies of Vattel, and there is evidence that I've found that William Tecumseh Sherman read this book too. But I can find no reference to it in McClellan's writings. With or without Vattel, what George McClellan did have is the laws of God, as he understood them by the light of his particular strain of Christianity, and it's to this topic that I want to turn now. One of the turning points in McClellan's antebellum life was his conversion to the Calvinist Presbyterianism of his wife, Mary Ellen, whom he called Nellie. You'll hear Nellie later on, during their courtship from October 1859 to May 1860. In his 1901 biography of McClellan, Peter Mickey gave a single sentence to this moment in McClellan's life and then said no more about the marriage, Christianity, or their effects on McClellan. Here's the sentence. It proved to be a union of 2 minds that were counterparts of each other, and of 2 souls whose mutual love was continually strengthened by the powerful influence of a Christian faith. In his introduction to the 1917 edition of McClellan's Mexican War Diary, William Starr Myers was similarly succinct. Here's his sentence. In after years, he, that's McClellan, became extremely serious, deeply and sincerely religious, sometimes oppressed, by a sense of duty. True as these statements may be, the truth behind them has not had a large effect on popular memory of the Civil War, in which the temperate Episcopalian Robert E. Lee and the zealous Presbyterian Stonewall Jackson are prominent fixtures. Few 21st century students of the Civil War think first of Christianity when they think of George McClellan, and few popular images of him suggest the connection. There is nothing, for example, about it in Ken Burns' 1990 documentary on the Civil War. Without looking at the memoir McClellan's Own Story, one would have no reason to distinguish McClellan in this context from the more secular-sounding William T. Sherman, Ulysses S. Grant, and Philip H. Sheridan. In Sherman's memoir, the word God appears 25 times. In Grant's personal memoirs, God appears only 6 times, always in quotations of other people. And in Sheridan's memoir, it appears 4 times, twice in quotations of other people and twice in an oath prescribed in the text of the 1867 Act to provide for the more efficient government of the rebel states. Readers of McClellan's Own Story will find the word God appearing 92 times, 7 in William Prime's biographical sketch, and 85 in the rest of the book, most often in excerpts of letters to Nellie. Following the lead of Mark Twain, some might say that this high number reveals the editorial hand of William Prime, whom Twain had called the gushing pietist. Following the lead of McClellan's best recent biographer, one might say that here is incontrovertible evidence of McClellan's messianic complex. Those who maintain that George McClellan's conversion brought him under the spell of a Messiah complex, which in turn guided his war-making on the Virginia Peninsula in 1862, either have to ignore some revealing moments in the correspondence excerpted in McClellan's Own Story, or they have to massage the word Messiah to suit their own purposes. Nowhere in the New Testament does the Messiah say anything that sounds like either of these vulnerable moments of McClellan's. And now this is the audience participation moment. You can look at your handout. And I'm under number 1. I'm not going to read you everything. I've just bolded some things to catch your eye. You'll get the point. This is McClellan writing to Nellie. I appreciate all the difficulties in my path. I feel in my inmost soul how small is my ability. Even if I had the greatest intellect that was ever given to man, the results remain in the hands of God. And then again, later, he wrote, I hope and trust that God will watch over, guide, and protect me. Perhaps I have really brought it on myself. When I see so much self-blindness around me, I cannot arrogate to myself greater clearness of vision and self-examination. Arrogate means to claim or to attribute to oneself. Writing to Nellie at these moments, McClellan showed himself in his mid-30s to be human, all too human. And to his credit, he was aware of it. Even his reference to the uselessness of hypothetically having the greatest intellect ever given to man showed disarming self-awareness. In a biography of his uncle, Confederate Cavalry General Fitzhugh Lee stated in a footnote, quoting now from Fitzhugh Lee, General Lee said after the war that he considered General McClellan the most intellectual of the Federal generals. But as both Lees learned after Grant assumed overall command in 1864, the most intellectual general and the most effective general are not necessarily the same. In context, the footnote followed the statement that General Lee was sorry to part with McClellan in November 1862. The cynical reading would be that Lee was sorry to part with someone he had bested in the Peninsula Campaign, if not in the later Maryland one that enabled Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, Fitzhugh Lee took his uncle's reference to his adversary's intellectual superiority to mean something quite different. Fitzhugh Lee took it to mean, and I'm quoting, that as long as McClellan was in command, everything would be conducted by the rules of civilized warfare. For his part, McClellan knew that his intellectual power often made him vain, arrogant, and, in the memorable formulation of William Starr Myers, one of the worst subordinates and best superiors that ever lived. I like that a lot. At least McClellan's frequent invocations of God included some knowledge of this truth. But for all these references to God, readers of 1887 might well have been able to notice distinct features of those references, or more accurately, distinct absences from them. Nowhere in McClellan's own story did McClellan mention Jesus. He never used the word Messiah or Savior. He never referred to the resurrection or, in a theological context, salvation. He never quoted or alluded to the Bible. Compare that with Lincoln. He spoke of sin exactly twice, as in a letter to Nellie of August 8, 1862, in which he said, "I will not permit this army to degenerate into a mob of thieves, nor will I return these men of mine to their families as a set of wicked and demoralized robbers. I will never have that sin on my conscience." But one does not have to call oneself a Christian to use the word in this familiar idiomatic way. We can begin to appreciate the distinct quality of McClellan's Christian rhetoric when we contrast it with that of Robert E. Lee, also writing privately to his wife, Mary, in a letter of November 15, 1856, sent from Fort Brown, Texas. This is now number 2. This is Lee. "It was pleasant to join in the prayers again. There is already enough Romanism in this country inherited from Mexico, and there is more want of the worship of spirit and truth in all the beauty of its sincerity and holiness. When I see its perversion by man from the purity preached by our Savior, I think it better for me to remain in the wilderness from whence I came and adore the great God." Lee's distaste for Mexican Catholicism imprinted this letter. And his particular brand of rebellious Calvinist Protestantism came through loud and clear with his insistence on the purity preached by our Savior. It came through in the biblical allusion to the wilderness, here associated not with the Judean desert, but with sparsely populated Texas. And it came through in the imperfectly remembered quotation of John 4:24 in the King James Version, where John says, "God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." These rhetorical features, along with Lee's references to divine spirit and private adoration of the great God, have no counterparts in McClellan's letters to Nellie. And one reason for the contrast with Lee is that for McClellan, God was primarily to be invoked or petitioned in the context of service, duty, and ethical conduct. God was not primarily to be praised and adored out of self-forgetting, worshipful love that had no practical or instrumental value. To say so is not to judge McClellan's Christianity negatively. It is to demonstrate that it operated within a limited bandwidth, usually involving pragmatic attitudes and behavior, more characteristic of fretfully busy Martha in the Gospel of Luke than of her sister, quietly contemplative Mary. For readers of McClellan's own story, both now and in 1887, this aspect of McClellan's personal faith becomes or became especially significant against the background of public debate beginning in 1862 about what it meant to wage Christian warfare. To us, that's an oxymoron, perhaps, but that was a major topic. To testimony by Fitzhugh Lee, we have already seen we could add 2 sentences that appear early in McClellan's own story. And this is now number 3, handout on your number 3. McClellan speaking, "Since the war, I have met many of my late antagonists. while acknowledging that they feared me more than any of the northern generals and that I had struck them harder blows when in the full prime of their strength, they have all said that I fought him like a gentleman and in an honorable way, and they felt nothing but respect for me. As with his ready pen, he so often did, in this passage, Mcclellan mixed boastfulness and self-justification with pathos and some important truth. It is easy to think about Grant's relentless 1864 overland campaign and scoff at McClellan's implicit pride in being most feared, but the qualification, when in the full prime of their strength, referring to the Confederacy, should give the scoffer pause. Although he himself labored under delusions about the strength of his enemy, not all of which were his fault, during the 7 days battles of June and July 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia, with somewhere near 90,000 soldiers, bristled with its greatest wartime strength. The Army of Northern Virginia never got that big again. At the beginning of the Overland Campaign 2 years later, 1864, Grant faced approximately two-thirds this number, and he still had as many as McClellan, or maybe more. More to the point are the words, I fought them like a gentleman and in an honorable way. Admittedly, one might prefer not to have McClellan testifying so baldly on his own behalf. But Fitzhugh Lee seconded the statement, and he added the relevant term, quoting from Fitzhugh Lee now, McClellan was always and everywhere a gentleman who believed in conducting warfare in a Christian and humane manner. For all the boastfulness and self-justification so off-putting to McClellan's critics, past and present, the pathos and the truth of his wartime career is that it coincided exactly with, and some would say helped to bring about, a seismic shift in United States strategy during the Civil War. This shift meant discarding an ineffectual ideal of fighting in the respectful manner of a humane Christian gentleman and adopting a newer, more expedient ideal of making war as humane as possible by making it as brief as possible, while making it as brief as possible by making it as hard as possible. The most famous apostles of this new creed were Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, and at least from the point of view of the loyal states, their success confirmed the new reasoning. To 21st century readers of McClellan's own story, some of whom may recollect that the same reasoning preceded the atomic bombing of Japan, the 1862 turning point in American military history may not feel comfortable, but from the perspective of today, it cannot help but look inevitable. To readers of 1887, however, with the Spanish-American War still a decade away and the wars of the 20th century inconceivable, the turning point was recent enough and post-war reconciliation difficult enough, thanks in part to hard war policies, that some could still think of McClellan as the champion of another kind of lost cause. Nowhere did the mismatch between McClellan's idea of waging Christian warfare and the new exigencies of the Civil War that would emerge after the turning points of the 7 days and the subsequent withdrawal of the Army of the Potomac to Harrison's Landing on the James River appear more sharply than in McClellan's 850-word to Abraham Lincoln of July 7, 1862. McClellan got this letter off to a tactful enough start, broaching his large subject with this carefully segmented, complex sentence. Sorry, that's an English professor's occupational hazard. This is McClellan. I cannot but regard our condition as critical, and I earnestly desire, in view of possible contingencies, to lay before your excellency for your private consideration my general views concerning the existing state of the rebellion, although they do not strictly relate to the situation of this army or strictly come within the scope of my official duties. In light of what followed, both in the letter itself and in the history of the war, many have come to view this letter, the Harrison Landing letter, as not merely one more distasteful instance of McClellan's arrogance, but as damning evidence of his gross insubordination. In undertaking to lecture Lincoln that the time has come when the government must determine upon a civil and military policy covering the whole ground of our national trouble, McClellan overstepped his purely military authority in ways that anticipated William T. Sherman exceeding his authority in drafting the initial surrender agreement with Joseph E. Johnston on April 17, 1865 in North Carolina. The composition and delivery of the Harrison's Landing letter were surely turning points for McClellan himself. Having read the letter in McClellan's presence, McClellan handed it to him at Harrison's Landing. Having read the letter in McClellan's presence, Lincoln did not respond at length, and the letter did not find its way into wide circulation until McClellan published his official report in 1864, Lincoln having relieved him from command in November 1862. I think this actually may be the anniversary of that. I think that's what the signs say if you ever drive up 29 North and go through Warrenton. But in the meantime, Lincoln did show McClellan's letter to members of his cabinet, and it helped to turn opinion against McClellan. Within 2 weeks, for example, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase was urging the president to remove his general. Beyond its immediate implications for his career, however, McClellan's letter captured in microcosm a major turning point of the war itself, invoking what McClellan called the highest principles known to Christian civilization and what he called the influences of Christianity and freedom. McClellan positioned these Christian principles and influences in opposition to the shifting policies emerging around him, very rapidly emerging. Only 11 days before the date of the Harrison's Landing letter, John C. Pope had been named commander of the new United States Army of Virginia, and within the next month, Pope's infamous General Orders 5, 6, 7, 11, and 13 indicated that the treatment of white Virginia civilians would no longer correspond to McClellan's idea of Christian warfare, the characteristics of which he spelled out explicitly for Lincoln in this letter. I'm on number 5 now. Number 4 I skipped for purposes of time, but it's very interesting reading. It's basically McClellan saying to his troops, you guys are going to observe the Sabbath, which was okay until battles started happening on the Sabbath. So now I'm on number 5. This rebellion has assumed the character of war, and it should be conducted upon the highest principles known to Christian civilization. It should not be at all a war upon population, but against armed forces and political organizations. Neither confiscation of property, political executions of persons, territorial organization of states, or forcible abolition of slavery should be contemplated for a moment. In prosecuting the war, all private property and unarmed persons should be strictly protected, subject only to the necessity of military operations. Skipping down, military power should not be allowed to interfere with the relations of servitude, meaning slavery. Slaves contraband under the Act of Congress seeking military protection should receive it. The right of the government to appropriate permanently to its own service claims to slave labor should be asserted, and the right of the owner to compensation, therefore, should be recognized. He's thinking about the first Confiscation Act of August 1861, and the second one is actually going to be happening right about now, July 1862. One more sentence. A system of policy thus constitutional and conservative and pervaded by the influence of Christianity and freedom would receive the support of almost all truly loyal men. Within a year, Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman would be prosecuting a different brand of warfare in Mississippi. And by the end of the war, Sherman's campaigns through Georgia and South Carolina and Sheridan's treatment of the Shenandoah Valley, all endorsed or ordered by Grant, would mark how sharp the turn after the Peninsula Campaign had been. In beginning to pull things together and move toward closure, I love that sentence when I hear it in a lecture, don't you? I really do. I want to consider a distinct feature of Mcclellan's own story that could have appealed to readers Mark Twain envisioned in 1887 more than to readers of today. That many of the soldiers who served under George McClellan had deep affection for him has not been news since Nathaniel Hawthorne published his account of his 1862 visit to Washington. What may be news, and what emerged in William Prime's editing, are the many instances in McClellan's memoir showing how fully McClellan returned his soldiers' affection and devotion. The major force operating behind these instances was McClellan's compassion for both his own soldiers and the soldiers they were fighting. Compassion is an explicit Christian ethic. It may be implicit in the Lieber Code, but it is never named there. One can argue that if McClellan had been able to detach himself from his compassion, he might have been a more aggressive and effective combat leader. One can also argue that some of the expressions of McClellan's compassion in McClellan's own story border on sentimentality, which can be the kiss of death for a 21st century reader. But 19th century readers differed in this respect, as Mark Twain well knew, and Twain's interest was not disinterested, and editor William Prime could deliver in this area, as Twain also knew. By the 1950s, the phrase bleeding heart had become a pejorative term, especially in the adjectival form bleeding heart liberal. Whew, the worst. Bleeding heart liberal. But when George McClellan wrote to Nellie in the aftermath of the debacle at 2nd Manassas Bull Run on the day Lincoln instructed him to resume command after the Confederate invasion of Maryland, such language had no such negative connotations for him. This is now number 6. It makes my heart bleed to see the poor, shattered remnants of my noble army of the Potomac, poor fellows, and to see how they love me even now. It is the most terrible trial I've ever experienced. Truly, God is trying me in the fire. Readers of 1887 could only have known this passage through the editorial offices of William Prime. It did not appear in McClellan's 1864 report. Confided to Nellie alone, this passage revealed the young commander in the grip of overwhelming emotion, hardly able to restrain himself, presumably from some outward display, such as weeping or howling or cursing, or all of them at once. That a psychoanalyzing critic looking over his shoulder 150 years later might take exception to his focus on himself only confirms the unguardedness of his outpouring to the wife who shared his theological language. There is no passage about the love between commander and soldier as powerfully raw in the memoirs of Sherman, Grant, and Sheridan, although Sheridan did describe the emotional leave-taking from his soldiers when he was ordered east in 1864. But there is an analogous passage in Recollections and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, and the congruence is significant. Also writing to his wife on Christmas Day, 1862, in the wake of his victory at Fredericksburg, and 3 months after McClellan's letter to Nellie, Lee spoke of his gratitude to Almighty God for his unspeakable mercies, and then adopted a very different tone, and this is number 7. But what a cruel thing is war. My heart bleeds at the death of every one of our gallant men. Even permitting the anachronism, no one could rightly call Lee a bleeding heart. And the similarity between the confessions of the two generals to their wives makes all the more poignant and remarkable another moment that readers of 1887 only could have known because of Prime's inclusion of a letter to Nellie of July 22, 1862, which was written at Harrison's Landing on the James. This is number 8. So the Peninsula Campaign has basically ended. and McClellan is now hemmed in there at Harrison's Landing. I'm about to do a thing today which will, I suppose, cause the abolitionists and my other friends to drive the last nail in my official coffin. You know that our sick and wounded in Richmond are suffering terribly for want of proper food, medicines, and hospital supplies. I have ordered a boatload of all such things: lemons, tea, sugar, brandy, underclothing, lint, bandages, chloroform, quinine, ice, etc., etc., to be sent up to General Lee today, to be used at his discretion for the sick and wounded of both armies. I know he would not and could not receive them from our men alone. Therefore, I can only do it in the way I propose and trust to his honor to apply them properly, half and half. Am I right or wrong? Am I right or wrong? McClellan's disarmingly vulnerable appeal to Nellie's judgment put before 1887 readers a McClellan unknown to most of us now. There is no hint of such vulnerability in the equestrian statue of McClellan on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., nor is there much acknowledgement of it among the harshest critics of McClellan. And yet there it was, on full display for his posthumous readership. The tightly knitted entanglement of political awareness, principled commitment to waging Christian warfare, and harrowing compassion for his soldiers that characterized McClellan as much as arrogance or caution. Was he right or was he wrong? In 1887, his editor believed him right, but now consensus largely believes him wrong, and critical thinking should guard against easy oversimplification or reduction. It should also ask McClellan's own question of the thousands of soldiers who loved him. Were they right or were they wrong? Was their devotion wholly misguided? Was it some kind of collective delusion? Did it signify nothing? At the very least, it suggests that George McClellan had some real gift, one we associate with the word charisma. Although used mostly in secular contexts now, this term has biblical connections as well, and those connections could not be wholly lost on biblically literate readers able to associate McClellan's visits to wounded soldiers in the hospitals with ministrations to the ailing and afflicted in first century Palestine. And I'm going to take a quick run now through the bold of number 9. He says, I have been through the hospitals where are many of our own men and of the rebels. I went on the hospital steamer. I saw all the officers and men on board and tried to cheer them up. This morning, I visited the General Hospital not far from here and went through it all, finding the patients comfortable and all improving in health. I like this sentence. I confess that the men enlist my sympathies much more warmly than the officers. And then finally, poor fellows, I can never willingly break the link that unites me to them and shall always be very proud of them and of their love for me, even if it is not decreed by Providence that I am to lead them to Richmond. Post-war readers encountered nothing like these moments in the memoirs of Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. We have other powerful images of hospital visits during the Civil War: Abraham Lincoln at City Point, Walt Whitman and Louisa May Alcott in Washington, Phoebe Pember in Richmond, but we do not have them in the best-known memoirs of other Civil War generals. And they would not have reached the public when they did, if not for William Prime working in cooperation with Mark Twain. Was George McClellan telling the truth when he confided to his wife that he would remain very proud of his soldiers and of their love for him, even if it is not decreed by Providence that I am to lead them to Richmond? If so, then he could be rightly proud the remainder of his life. Were George McClellan's hospital visits or the devotion they signified enough to answer all the charges of his critics, then or now? No, they were not, and they are not. But they were and they are a large part of McClellan's own story, the story of what it meant to him to fight like a Christian gentleman. And to underestimate that story is to slight history and to bow to amnesia. Thank you very much. It's 1:41. I was asked, very politely, to wind it up by 1:45 so people could be elsewhere. But if anyone would like to ask anything or say something, other than I still hate George McClellan, which... Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know the extent to which his political ambitions either propelled his conduct of war in the early years or derived from it.
Yeah, that's very good. The question is, to what extent did McClellan's political interests and ambitions influence any of the stuff that we are talking about? Is that a fair? Okay. Yeah, I mean, the officer corps of the United States was a snake pit in the early 1860s. You have Republican generals, you have Democrat generals, you have generals who have no business being generals at all, but they happen to be politicians. Nathaniel Banks was an example, Republican. McClellan was identified with the Democratic Party for sure, but he also was an excellent soldier. And so he wasn't a sham, he wasn't a fake. When he entered the war, you can tell from the Harrison's Landing letter, he's entering on the same terms that Lincoln was, which is that we are not going to interfere with slavery where it now exists. What started to happen is, in part because McClellan failed, parenthesis, and because Robert E. Lee succeeded on the peninsula, is that Lincoln started going, oh my goodness, we need to amp this game up a bit. And so that's when serious talk about let's move the Emancipation Proclamation along begins. At that point, McClellan is not happy because McClellan is a Democrat. He's a respecter of states' rights. His candidate was Stephen A. Douglas. And as the Republican Party becomes identified with emancipation, McClellan veers. So that then he's relieved in November of '62, and then he becomes, not eagerly right away, he becomes the Democratic candidate in 1864. And it's his candidacy around which people who are tired of the war, which by the fall of 1864 everybody was, are beginning to find a way to perhaps end it. If the war had ended, and if McClellan had won and the war had ended, I might have had to use a passport to get here. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So in other words, he is a real general. He's not a sham, but politics was definitely part of it. Anything else? Holt?
You can point out that the Harrison's Landing letter is a virtual paraphrase of Jomini.
That's very good. That's great.
And I assume that McClellan had read it.
Yes. Oh no. We're talking about Baron Jomini's Art of War, and I'm very sure that McClellan read it. I was actually in a thrilling moment in a academic setting. I was in a class which I was co-teaching with my now, alas, retired colleague, Gary W. Gallagher, and a student was doing a report on Jomini, and he brought in a library copy, and he opened it up, and this is right off the stacks, and on the flyleaf was printed Henry Halleck. It was Halleck's book. It was Halleck's copy of Jomini. Everyone was like, whoa, so take this to special collections right away. Well, of course, that's always a fraught thing because you go to special collections and they go, another old book? What do we care? But all by way of saying, you're very right. Yeah, that's good. There should be, I probably should talk about him as well, Jomini. Other things? Thank you very much, especially on a Friday afternoon.